Welcome to Think Change. I'm Sara Pantuliano. Today we're discussing the future of multilateralism as the world shifts towards regionalism, with power increasingly driven by strength over law. The United States, once a cornerstone of the rules based order, now clearly sees multilateralism through a very transactional lens. It's oscillating between retreat and selective re engagement, and is treating global cooperation more as a business than a shared responsibility. This shift has created uncertainty and has left a vacuum. Other nations are adapting. Some hope this trend is temporary. Others welcome a less interventionist America. Others still are exploiting the fragmentation it has triggered. So, what's at stake for multilateralism? And can a coalition of smaller powers revive it? Well, joining me to discuss these issues is a star cast. I'm really delighted to welcome on Think Change Lord Mark Mallow-Brown, former president of the Open Society Foundation and UN Secretary General, as well as UNDP administrator. Joining Mark is Ambassador Antonio Patriota, Brazil's ambassador to the United Kingdom, and former Brazil's foreign minister, as well as former Brazil's permanent representative to the UN, during which time he chaired the Commission on the Status of Women, as well as the UN Peacebuilding Commission. And last but not least, our very own Yunnan Chen, Research Fellow at ODI. Let's dive in. Mark, I'd like to start with you. The UN was founded on the principle that international cooperation could curb great power rivalries. And yet today we're seeing an erosion of that very idea. Major powers are increasingly bypassing multilateral institutions in favor of unilateral deals. So are we witnessing the end of institutional multilateralism as we know it, or do you think this is simply a moment of reinvention?
Well, I think it's a moment of great crisis and risk for the system, which still could end in an exciting reinvention, but equally could lead to a dramatic reduction of the effectiveness of the system and its further marginalization. I don't think the outcome is already set. I think it's how people react to the current crises which will determine it. And nor do I think the current crises, are in a sense short run. I think it's very easy to see the crisis now as very much prompted by the victory of President Trump and his re-election to a new term. And he's obviously, already targeted parts of the multilateral system, principally the UN agencies, in his demand for a review of their effectiveness and value for money to the United States. But we need to look behind that to see that this pattern of bypassing the UN actually has much longer roots than that. It was not the United States, but Russia, which invaded a neighbor and went to war and breached the primary obligation of the UN, the respect for national borders. It was, a series of countries that have sort of overstepped the mark in the Middle East and let a desperate conflict there, run out of control and be a breach of international human rights norms. So, this is a much bigger phenomenon than just one election in the US. And, I think the way back and the way to a renewed UN is through a series of middle powers, really stepping up and taking the responsibility and acknowledging that this may have been a system built by the winners of World War II to run the world in their own image, if you like.
Well, Ambassador, do you agree with Mark? Will we see a new model of global governance that includes, both traditional powers and emerging ones equally, or will we see a shift towards a more fragmented and regionalized system?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and very honored to be in the same panel as Mark and Yunnan. Let's start by recognizing that the multilateral system has been evolving throughout its history. So, there's adaptation going on all the time. Decolonization multiplied the number of UN members. More recently, in 2005, a Human Rights Council replaced the Human Rights Committee as a kind of permanent body that can meet at any moment in the year. A Peace Building Commission was created. Then you have, for example, a less formal mechanism like the G20 that replaced the G7, for a while also known as G8, in recognition of the more multipolar distribution of geopolitical influence in today's world. So there's scope for recognizing that multilateralism is flexible, is adaptable. Now, what is of concern, and here I agree with Mark, is the persistent erosion of respect for international law and freely entered into disciplines. And the violation, in fact, is being carried out by countries that we would have expected to be the guarantors of the current order. So this is very destabilizing and very troubling. But it's been going on also for some time. So it's not an entirely new phenomenon. We can think of Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, Israel's illegal occupation of territory, more recently the invasion of Ukraine, etc. What I often say is that it's not because some cars disrespect traffic lights that you're going to do away with, transit rules, and so we need to preserve the law, even if there is transgression and erosion. But the troubling feature that I see today is that we may be reaching a tipping point. We are used to talking about a tipping point when it comes to climate, a point beyond which global warming will make life in planet Earth uninhabitable. So I think we have to be very careful not to allow a similar phenomenon to happen with the system itself. And the best way to counter that very dark and disturbing hypothesis that would bring us back to pre-Westphalian international relations is by engaging in preservation of the current model, but accepting that it requires transformation and reform. So in this respect, I don't usually use the term middle powers, but I think there are regional powers of global influence, what would be a breakdown in multilateral order, because in today's world, it's very easy to align with countries that are not part of your region.
Great. I like your framing of regional powers with global influence. 10 years ago at ODI, actually, we started referring to them as rising global powers. So this aligns well with that concept. Yunnan, I'd like to turn to you. With the US shifting between retreat and selective re-engagement in multilateralism, the role of China in global governance is becoming even more pivotal. What can we expect from China's approach to global engagement today?
Thank you, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to be joining this discussion with such a distinguished panel. If we're thinking about the big picture, this retreat of the US from the multilateral order and this growing skepticism to globalization is also part of a bigger geopolitical story, which is that the US perceives, rightly or wrongly, that it is facing a hegemonic decline, and this is also part of a picture of growing rivalry between the US and the second largest power, China. With the retreat of the US, with the cutbacks to US aid and the likely pullback in funding to other multilateral organs, this raises the natural question of whether or not China can fill that gap. And there's a growing expectation that China will do so. I think there's certainly going to be a greater credibility that China carries in its role, in its potential leadership on the global stage and in supporting the multilateral system. But I think there's two questions of whether China has the political ambition to underwrite this existing global order in the absence of the US or the pullback of the US. And second, whether it has the capacity to. I think the answer to both is no. One way to frame it is that China has tried to challenge the norms within the system, but it's not tried to change the form of the system.
Thanks, Yunnan. Mark, to follow from what Yunnan was saying in terms of China not really trying to change the global governance form, the structure. You've been leading this initiative on rethinking Bretton Woods at 80. What are some of the practical reforms within the global governance system that could better reflect these new geopolitical realities without undermining the core principles of the system?
Well, obviously, the bone that everybody pulls at is the issue of the US preserving a veto-like power in the two institutions. But in truth, actually Europe is more overrepresented in terms of the calculation around national GDP than the US is. And, there has been a history of reductions of different countries' roles and steady growth in those of others. It's not been frozen like, say, the Security Council has been all these years. There has been steady reallocation. And, obviously many countries, though, rightly want to see more. But I think there is probably a recognition that it's going to be very difficult to do that during this particular administration term in Washington, that it will remain a medium-term ambition, but that it's other changes which may matter more for BWI governance in the shorter term. I think for the World Bank particularly, it's not just the issue of broadening the governance and bringing in those more forceful regional powers. It's actually also inverting a power system which has always had the sort of choice of economic ideology, the choice of economic priorities, resting with Washington in terms of the headquarters of the institution rather than in the country itself. And so while it seems like a kind of overstated theme of development, I think at the core of successful reform is actually country ownership of its own development strategy and making the bank an enabler and facilitator of that, rather than these vestiges of a colonial past where it was for the bank to almost pre-order what development priorities should be. So I think the short-term next 4 years shifts in governance and models are going to be much more to country and region rather than to successfully reordering the sort of actual global governance layer.
Thanks. Ambassador, what can Brazil and other regional powers of global influence, as you call them, really do? What kind of specific actions can they take to help reshape this global decision-making process?
Well, the simplest way I can find to describe what at least Brazil's ambition would be, and I believe that there's quite significant agreement among developing countries in this regard, is to adopt an agenda that could be described as democratization of international relations. Now, what do I mean by that? I think in domestic democracy, there are at least two fundamental traits that if they are absent, you cannot call a country a democracy. And this is the idea that the rule of law applies indistinctively to everyone, whether you're very powerful economically or you're very vulnerable. And the other idea is that you have representative decision-taking within the country, right? So take Italy, for example. If Sardinia and Sicily were to be absent from the national parliament, that would not be democratic. Or if the law did not apply to people who have income above a certain number of billions of euros, neither would that be democratic. So I think what we need is a reaffirmation of the applicability of international law universally. And this is easier said than done. But I think if governments, civil society, academia, individuals with a strong state, Mark was part of Open Society Foundation, who has played a very important role in this regard, unite, I think there will be a very strong movement in favor of this concept. And equally, the notion that you can't have a Security Council with a permanent member nucleus that excludes parts of the world like Latin America, Africa, South Asia, especially within an environment where you see a growing number of international players with diplomatic influence. I often divide, when you look at whether we are in a post-unipolar or bipolar or non-polar, whatever the terminology you prefer, I tend to distinguish between military, economic, and diplomatic. I think in the military sphere, there are three major actors, which would be the United States or NATO, depending on whether you think there's a future for this military alliance or not. Then you would have Russia and China. On the economic sphere, the European Union is a very significant actor, and maybe you could consider the G20 members as relevant players. But when it comes to diplomacy, different considerations apply. And although sometimes a country such as Brazil is described as an emerging country, I believe emerging may apply to our economic relevance. But diplomatically speaking, I think we're a very established country. We are number 10, a number of embassies around the world. We hold the record for the number of times we've been elected to the Security Council. We are a founding member of the United Nations, etc. So I find that countries with a profile similar to that of my own, that are engaged in democratizing international relations, need to coalesce internationally, but also derive some support and strength from institutions such as ODI, OSF, think tanks. There's the Global Governance Forum. There's the Quincy Institute that has produced an excellent report on a better world order, and so on.
And Yunnan, what role do you think China can or will play in this process of democratization of international relations that the ambassador is referring to?
There's a lot of large and complicated issue areas in which I think China can certainly play a role. And I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic about certain spheres or certain global orders, and more pessimistic about others. So I don't think we're seeing the end of multilateral cooperation entirely. I do agree with Mark that we are going to see a bit more decentralization and perhaps more regional bloc building. But even at the regional level, when it comes to China and China's role in the Asia region, I think it can also be quite fraught and complicated, given the rivalries between China and Japan in East Asia. You still have a lot of security concerns when it comes to Southeast Asian powers or the Philippines, particularly in issues around the South China Sea. And so these kinds of power dynamics, even at the regional level, are something that we'll need to pay attention to when it comes to talking about multilateralism at the regional level. But I do think that there's going to be a bit of a shift in moving away maybe from these kind of norm-based or geographic historical alliances towards more issue-based areas of cooperation and governance. So on climate, for example, this is one area where I do see China potentially playing a stabilizing and very collaborative role with other regional blocs or other emerging powers, particularly from Europe, as well as from middle powers like Brazil, like South Africa. What comes to mind is, in the last Trump administration, despite Trump's and the US's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, this was a time when China did assert quite significant political leadership. It pushed further on its own decarbonization goals. It pledged carbon neutrality by 2060. And since 2016, recently, China issued a statement that it actually committed up to 25 billion in climate finance since 2016. And of course, China has a lot of strong economic interests that are very much tied into a global energy transition. But I do see climate, as well as areas like development and health, development finance, green finance. These are all areas where there is still potential for greater coalition building and for cooperation. I do see, I'm a little more pessimistic on other areas. So when it comes to multilateralism and global trade, I think this is one area where we will see more fragmentation and potentially breakdown. even within existing structures, you have the OECD arrangement that tries to regulate trade. You have the WTO, which has absorbed some of these norms around the use of subsidies or export credit. These rules are becoming increasingly diluted, let's say, by the actions of states themselves. The cuts to ODA as well. I think all of these worrying signs are showing a pullback and a breakdown of some of the norms that governed how northern donors, northern partners have been using public finance for the last 50 or so years. And we're really returning to a bit more of a mercantilist world where national interests and national commercial interests are going to dominate.
To be honest, I'm also deeply concerned about the breakdown in our ability to guarantee and safeguard peace and security. And that's something that both Mark and Ambassador Patriot have dedicated significant time to. And of course, I've also worked for a long time to support the UN peacebuilding efforts. This year actually marks a critical moment as the UN conducts its 5-year review of the peacebuilding architecture. Given the current geopolitical tensions, this reassessment couldn't come at a more challenging time. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Do you see viable pathways to strengthening multilateral peace and security efforts in such a fractured landscape?
I would say, first, it's very hard not to believe that we're entering an era of more, not less conflict. And even President Trump, in his first remarks about the UN on returning to office, wished that the UN would stick to what he saw as its core mission of peace building and peacemaking. And so I think, in a strange way, there may be a broader global consensus for working again to try and strengthen some of these mechanisms. The difficulty is, will that consensus stretch to using those mechanisms? Because what we're seeing is a massive bypassing of the Security Council as the primary mechanism for conflict resolution. The UN has been largely invisible in all the principal conflicts recently, and that reflects the post-norm world that we've been describing in this conversation. And so, I think we're in this strange position that people would acknowledge that this is a core mandate and should be invested in, and then promptly come a conflict that they have an interest in, bypass the use of the UN and sort of forum shop for either a bilateral solution or a much more selective solution about who sits at the table when it comes to peacemaking. And one final point, the real horror story of recent conflicts is how few of them have actually been ended by a peace agreement, and how many of them have been actually resolved by one side prevailing and overwhelming its opponent.
Yes, Ambassador, if you want to add anything to this.
Yes, actually 2 or 3 comments. One comment I'd like to make is actually about China. And I was listening to our colleague. I can understand the notion that China will not aspire to fill in the role that the United States has played historically. This is perfectly understandable financially and otherwise. But I think the direction of the evolution of the international system places China in a very important position, because in comparative terms, it is the least unilateralist of the great military powers. So there's a lot to be said about that. And the fact that China is meeting its responsibilities on the climate agenda, which is one of the strategic agendas for the future of the survival of humankind on Earth, is also very significant. I was at a dinner here in London the other day with very prominent specialists on climate change, and they were recognizing the extraordinary contribution that China has been making, including the accelerated pace in which it is evolving towards electric vehicles, for example, and renewable sources of energy. Now, that places it independently of the desire of the current authorities in Beijing in a certain position of leadership. And I think it'll be very important for China to understand this role and cooperate internationally, because I think the big systemic threat that we face is not country A, B, or C, it's unilateralism. Another of the new developments that we've been observing internationally is something that's quite unusual, and that as a representative of a country from the Southern Hemisphere, not only global South, but literally below the equator, is a crisis in the global North. So how does the world deal with a crisis in the global North? It's very troubling, very destabilizing. It's in many respects takes us into uncharted waters. But I think one of the consequences is that it raises the level of responsibility of the rest of the world in trying to find paths forward that will enhance opportunities for diplomacy. I'm very troubled, again, as a Brazilian diplomat, when I see all this emphasis on increase in military budgets. Military activity has not been providing the solutions to the challenges that we face internationally. I think that the channeling of resources that are dramatically necessary to combat hunger and poverty, combat global warming and environmental degradation should not be channeled into destructive purposes. So this is another area where I think we need to work with youth movements, with some of the more idealistic voices in the international community, the Greta Thunbergs of this world, to really press the idea that unless we look at our priorities in a rational way, we may be evolving into a march of folly, where you place your scarce resources into objectives that are detrimental to your very ultimate interests as an international society. So this is where I believe that in addition to looking at mechanisms that are more representative, democratic, we also need to mobilize international opinion to link some of these fundamental challenges we are facing: environmental, peace and security, development, and combating hunger and poverty.
I couldn't agree more. In my valedictory letter to the UN Secretary General, when I was chairing the Peace Building Fund of the UN until last year, I was very much, saying that we need to take the moment to try and build and support, the growing of a constituency for peace. Try and really, inspiring young people to push the politicians to act differently, because I couldn't agree more. The defense spending, defense budgets are not going to provide us the security and the peace that we need. We're very much at time. I just want to ask each of you one final question. If you had to propose just one bold but achievable reform to strengthen multilateralism, what would that be? And what would the first step to making it happen be? Who wants to start?
I think it's Antonio's time to start.
My answer will probably not satisfy you. I think I would refer people to the Summit of the Future outcome and to the outcome of the G20 that Brazil presided over last year. I mean, we actually reached a consensus in Rio on a certain number of, relatively vaguely formulated objectives, but strengthening General Assembly, looking at gender issues, opening up to a larger spectrum of candidates, positions in multilateral organizations, reform of Security Council, creating a permanent mechanism to deal with climate. This is something that Brazil is now on record. But maybe the one answer that encompasses all of this is something that Brazil has decided to promote, which is the idea of a review conference of the United Nations Charter. And recently, India and South Africa associated themselves to this proposal. It can be adopted by a majority resolution in the General Assembly, and it is not subject to a veto of the Security Council. It also requires a Security Council resolution, but is not subject to a veto. Now, many skeptics will say, oh, this can open a Pandora's box. My answer is that there are times in history where Pandora may actually be welcome. It's better than welcoming Cassandra, or the apocalypse. But what I believe is that you can also establish up front certain areas of the charter that cannot be played around with, and really concentrate on, the collective responsibility towards the planet, the need to introduce more democratic decision-taking, and some of the topics where we already have a consensus according to the Summit of the Future outcome and the G20 platform.
Mark, do you agree?
I certainly do. I would, for me, my one choice, though, within Antonio's longer list would be, with the US having pulled out of the climate negotiations, again out of COP, I would use this moment for a bold reform of the climate architecture, which will make the US very sorry indeed that its voice is not at the table, because when it chooses to come back some years from now, it will find a climate machinery with much greater enforcement powers and much greater ambition than the one it left.
Yunan, what's your suggestion?
My suggestion will fit in quite nicely with the others. I think starting with the premise that the old institutions aren't dead. They may be a little bit outdated, but they should still serve their purpose. I would say that we need to take another look at quota reform when it comes to the Bretton Woods institutions. We're coming up for a quota review at the IMF. And this is an area where we know that the global South countries and emerging economies have been systematically underrepresented. As Mark was saying, Europe, Japan, and you could argue even China perhaps is overrepresented. If we are facing a potential black swan event of the US pulling out of these and a scrabble for how we reorder the distribution of power, it's best to have that conversation before that happens. And I think this would need some kind of politics and political consensus between the European bloc, with Japan, with China, to agree to restrain their own shares within that voting allocation. We may see China not get the voice that it wants, but I think to create a truly multilateral institution that represents the needs of its recipients and beneficiaries, and not just its donors, we need to restructure the system as it exists.
Countries like Brazil, India, South Africa should push the IMF and the World Bank for voting reforms so that they have real decision-making power, not just a seat at the table. Second, climate action must be backed by enforcement. If the US steps back from COP, well, other major economies should push forward with binding commitments and trade incentives that reward compliance. And third, the UN system needs reform. Brazil's proposal for a UN Charter review, I think, is a real opportunity to modernize the Security Council and give regional powers a stronger voice. These aren't just ideas, they are changes that governments and civil society can push for now. Thank you to our guests, Mark, Ambassador Patriota, Yunan. Thank you so much for your insights. And thank you for listening. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe and share. Until next time.